Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for U.S. History 1. Today we are going to be talking about colonial growth and development. As always, there are some key terms you should be able to identify by the end of this lecture. One thing that's a little different here is you'll see some of them are regional terms. The New England, the Middle Colonies, and Southern Colonies. These are all different regions of the 13 colonies. And what I mean here is you should be able to identify them on a map, and you also should know how each region differed from the other. As always, there are also some key questions at the bottom that by the time you get to the last slide, you should be able to answer. So anyway, let's get to it. By the middle of the 1700s, England had established 13 colonies on the coast of North America. The first of these colonies was, of course, Virginia, which was founded in 1607 at Jamestown. The last colony to be established was Georgia, which was founded in 1739. But as we saw in our discussions of Virginia and New England, you cannot really generalize when it came to England's 13 colonies. Over time, each region developed a unique society and a unique economy. For example, let's look at New England. New England had been established originally as a haven for Puritans fleeing religious persecution in England. Over time, they developed a commercial economy. In other words, most people in New England made their living from shipping, importing, and exporting items that were bought and sold around the world. The so-called middle colonies included New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. While shipping was an important part of the economies of these colonies too, agriculture played an even bigger role. Rich farmland allowed for the growth and sale of food products, such as wheat, which could be exported to the other colonies. By far the most profitable colonies, however, were the southern colonies, which practiced plantation agriculture. This meant they grew valuable products like tobacco, sugar, and rice that could be exported to Europe. Now, as the colonies grew, they began to attract immigrants from around Europe. Of course, the first group to take a chance on these colonies were the English. But soon, the colonies were becoming a melting pot of various ethnic groups from across Europe. Some of the first non-English groups to immigrate to the 13 colonies were the Germans, the Scots, and the Dutch. Finally, if we're going to talk about immigration to the colonies, we can't forget the involuntary immigrants. In other words, the hundreds of thousands of African slaves who were kidnapped and forced into slavery in the Americas. These immigrants helped the colonies to grow. We can see this with a look at some demographic numbers. In 1625, for example, the two colonies of Jamestown and Plymouth had a combined population of about 2,000 people. 75 years later, by 1700, there were about 250,000 people living in England's 12 colonies. Remember, Georgia hadn't been founded yet. And 75 years after that, at the start of the American Revolution, that number had swollen to about 2.5 million people. So what kind of societies were these? America in 1700 was overwhelmingly rural. Most colonists either lived on farms or in very, very small towns and villages. However, cities were starting to grow as well. Philadelphia was the largest city in the colonies, with about 30,000 people. Now that may not seem like much today, but it was enough to make Philly the second largest city in the British Empire, after London, of course. New York was the second largest colonial city, with about 25,000 residents, and Boston was third, with about 16,000. Growth came at a cost, however. We've already talked about the cost paid by African Americans. As the southern colonies grew, so did slavery. This growth sometimes led to explosive violence, such as the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. But Native Americans also paid a very high cost for colonial growth. As populations throughout the colonies grew, the colonists put more and more pressure on the lands of native peoples. This pressure sometimes exploded into violence. The most serious of these explosions was an event known as Metacom's War, or sometimes known as King Philip's War. The war was fought between the eastern woodland tribes of the Northeast and the Puritans of New England. Ironically, the Puritans of New England had historically had good relations with the peoples that lived around them. Remember, it was Squanto who introduced the Puritans at Plymouth to the Wampanoag people. Of course, there were exceptions. The Puritans had fought a brutal war with the Pequots over lands in the Connecticut River Valley in 1636 and 1637. The map on the left shows New England at the time of the Pequot War. The growing colonial towns and cities were just beginning to infringe on lands claimed by the Wampanoags, the Narragansetts, and other tribes in New England. Pressure on Indian lands simply increased as the populations of the New England colonies grew. Look closely at this map. The native peoples did not move west with Puritan growth. Instead, they lived among the English colonists in their own communities. This causes problems. One of the biggest problems involved farming. The Puritans kept cattle and pigs. Unlike today, however, when these animals are penned up in pastures or in pens, back then the animals were allowed to just kind of roam free. Often they trampled the Indian fields of corn and squash. The colonists also drove off many of the animals that the native peoples had relied upon for food. Another tension was religion. The Puritans worked to convert the native peoples to Christianity. Many did convert, but many did not. Tensions arose within tribes between Christian Indians and non-Christian Indians. These tensions exploded in 1675 when a Christian Indian named Sassaman was murdered by non-Christian Wampanoags. The Puritans demanded justice. They captured the men that they believed were responsible for the murder and executed them. At this point, the situation reached a boiling point. To retaliate for the executions, Metacom, the leader of the Wampanoags, ordered a major attack on the Puritan settlements across New England. The Puritans called Metacom King Philip, hence this conflict is sometimes known as King Philip's War. Metacom actually nearly succeeded in destroying New England. He and his native allies attacked and burned towns throughout New England. His instructions were to burn every town and to kill all Englishmen. In all, about 3,000 colonists died in the war. The colonists were equally brutal, however, as they burned Indian towns. Nor did they distinguish between Indians who fought with Metacom from those who were neutral. All Indians were guilty just because they were Indians. Approximately 6,000 natives died in the war. Hundreds of others were captured and sold into slavery. The war lasted about 2 years, and in 1676 Metacom was captured and killed. Ultimately, his body was beheaded and his head placed on display in the city of Plymouth. It stood there for years. So what were the consequences of Metacom's war? For one thing, the Puritans saw the war in religious terms. They believed that God was angry with them for losing their faith. They were no longer God's chosen people. They were no longer a, quote, city on a hill, end quote. They needed to return to God to win back his favor. The consequences were much more severe for the Indians of New England. Their loss in this war broke their power. Many were forced to move west. Their lands were now freed up for more English expansion. So in conclusion, by 1750 there were 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. These colonies varied greatly from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania to Georgia. Moreover, most native resistance had ended. Native peoples remained strong to be sure. However, their strength lay west of the Appalachian Mountains. East of those mountains, the English were completely in control. And just because the Revolution is 25 years away, don't get the idea that the colonists were interested in independence. In 1750, these colonies were still thoroughly English. Many considered themselves Englishmen and women first, and Virginians or South Carolinians second.